We are in Old Testament survey. This is part 2 of the book of Genesis. So we started the first half on Sunday, and so we're going to finish up the book of Genesis before moving on to some of the other big events, the Exodus and things of that nature. So good to see you all. Okay, so we talked about on Sunday, just kind of a quick review, real quick here. You can really break down Genesis into two major parts, right? So part 1 was what we're calling the origins history. How was the world created? What was man's role? What did God do? What happened when sin entered the world? Things like that. And we looked at 4 big events. So memorization here, you can mnemonically remember the first half of Genesis, 4 big events. And they are creation, the fall of man, then the flood, Robert, thank you. And then, of course, the one we took 30 seconds to talk about on Sunday morning, the dispersion, what happens after the flood. So, first half of Genesis focuses on 4 big events. What we're talking about tonight, the second half of Genesis, focuses on 4 great individuals. And they should be listed on your handout: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Or if you want to get technical, the sons of Jacob would be the 4th one. But mnemonically, it's easy to remember 4 big events, 4 big characters, the first half and the second half of the book. So, the first 11 chapters kind of really sets the stage now when we talk about these individuals in really one family. God's created all things perfect in the beginning. Sin enters the world by means of Adam and Eve. And as we talked about, Robert, you just alluded to, the degradation of man gets worse and worse and worse and worse as we go along. Cultivated, God says something has to be done. His plan is to destroy the world and start over to a certain degree through Noah and through his family, that remnant going forward. And so here's our objective to tonight. In looking at chapters 12 through 50, we're not going to read any of that, or at least in its entirety, obviously. Big section here. Going back to chapter 3, we're going to see that God plans on rescuing and redeeming His creation, and He's going to do it by this one single family line. And we're going to see that tonight. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'm going to suggest to you this evening that these 4 individuals or groups of individuals, if you want to think about it that way, are united by 2 big themes. 2 big themes. One is, sadly, repeated failures, mistakes, struggles. These individuals, while there was moments of faith and great things they did, they made some very poor decisions, very, very poor decisions. Some of it, I think, was based out of maybe fear. Maybe some of it was based on a lack of faith. And maybe some of these things we're going to talk about was just stupid decisions they decided to make on their own. So that's the first thing unites them. They all make some pretty poor choices. Second thing that unites these individuals is that God takes it upon Himself to intervene, protect, redeem, guide, direct these individuals so that His blessings will flow through them. So tonight we're going to do things maybe a little bit different, maybe what you've done in the past. Normally, I think, at least me anyway, in talking about these individuals, we typically focus on one individual and look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then move to the second one. I want to do a little bit different. I want us tonight to look at the failures together of these people. So let's talk about, hey, where were some of these mistakes they made, things they got themselves in trouble, and after establishing that baseline, then we'll talk about the blessings, the good things that God did for these individuals. Does that make sense? And the objective, again, is to see that in spite of all these shortcomings these individuals had, God is the one who takes it upon Himself to intervene and causes a lot of these bad things, if you will, to come together for a greater purpose. Does that make sense? Kind of where we're going, I guess, maybe to a certain degree? Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk about Abraham. So, Old Testament review here. Who's Abraham's father? Terah. So Terah was Abraham's father, and from Noah to Terah was 9 generations, right? So we're not talking just a couple generations away from the flood. We're talking 9 generations down from the flood, Terah. And where is Terah's family, Abraham's father, where is Abraham's ancestral homeland at this point? You may remember? Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur of the Chaldeans. So that's the ancestral homeland of this family. You have Terah, who had 3 sons, Abraham being one of them. The scripture doesn't say specifically why, but for some reason, or for a reason I should say, Terah takes his family, uproots them, and their plan is to go to the land of Canaan. Again, it doesn't say specifically why that's the plan. We read about that in chapter 11. However, something happens. On the way to Canaan, they stop at a place called Haran. Haran, so if you think of kind of geography here, so most people assume kind of Ur was kind of Iraq area, modern day. Haran would be kind of modern day Syria, if you will. So a good distance, but not in Canaan yet. But they stop in Haran, and they really more or less decide to settle there to a certain degree, because one of the big things happens there. One, Terah dies. He dies in Haran, and so the family, it seems, kind of stays there. But then something big happens. What happens after Abraham's father dies? You might remember? Okay, look in chapter 12. The call of Abraham, Brian, as you just alluded to. Look in chapter 12, verse 1. Let me pause for just 1 second. I do realize that Abraham's first name was Abram, same with Sarah and Sarai, so if I get those out of order on the chronology, please forgive me. I am aware his name was originally Abram, not Abraham, so I probably already messed that up a few times already tonight. Okay, now the Lord said to Abram, 12 verse 1, "Go from your country, from your kindred, from your father's house, the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So again, we're very familiar with that, the first kind of promise, if you will, to Abraham. It's interesting, though, in kind of a New Testament reference here, just real quick. In Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7, he specifically he calls out the dialogue between God and Abraham here in chapter 12. And he makes the point, it connects it, I should say, using a one-word verb that has 4 different aspects to it. So what does God say? God says, go. Where does he tell Abram? What's he say? Go what? Go from his land. Now, go from his land. Okay, he's going to show him where to go. But from his relatives, number 2. From his father's house, number 3. And number 4, to a land down of where Abraham, what he's going to show him specifically. So there's a different aspect, I think, that kind of Stephen brings out in Acts chapter 7. But we do read, if you remember, that Abraham was 75 years old when he departed Haran, along with his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and their possessions, and he obeys the Lord and travels to this land of Canaan. Right.
I think it's kind of noteworthy that when man fell, and everybody fell into sin, and God destroyed the world, and of course he promised he would not do that again by flood and water, man fell again, obviously. But this time, instead of responding with destruction, he gives the promised blessing, in which we read about in Galatians, of course, is that promised blessing is Christ.
Yep.
So I always thought that. And by the way, as you read in Genesis, you see that Abram and his family were not worshipers of Yahweh. They were probably idol worshipers, and yet God called him. And then, a point of trivia, that he is also descended from an earlier ancestor, Eber, which is Eberite, where they get the word Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Abraham's the first man to be called Hebrew in Genesis.
Yep, that's really good. Good point. Good point. Okay, so we're in the land of Canaan. Abram, his family are there. We're not going to read these accounts because I think they're probably familiar with these. So you guys tell me, what were some of Abraham's struggles, shortcomings? Where did he maybe, mistakes, mess ups? What did he do? Lie in what way, Linda?
Said that Sarah was his sister
Yep.
and not his wife.
We're going to come back to that. So I'm going to call it facing danger. Okay? How many times did he do it, Linda? Twice. Well done. He does it once in chapter 12, and then further on, I think it's in chapter 20 specifically. Two different instances. Okay? So that's one of them. What else? So I'm going to call that facing danger. Linda, to your point, he does it once, and then he does it again. What else? Brian?
God, and therefore he obeyed Sarah to conceive with Hagar.
Facing delay of the promises of God. Abraham and Sarah were old. They'd been in the promised land many years at that point, and so we'll talk about that specifically. Anyone else you want to mention something? Any other things you want to mention, I should say? I'm going to throw one more, and it's at the beginning. I'm going to say facing drought. Steve, do you like that? That was for you and Daniel. Facing drought, danger, delay, and danger. All D's. I'm trying. There's probably a sermon there or two, I guess. Okay, so I'm looking in chapter 12, and let's kind of go through these individually, if you will, just kind of real high level, just to talk through them. So actually, verse 10, I should say. Chapter 12, verse 10. So Abraham arrives at the promised land. Verse 10 says, now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. This may be a little bit of a stretch, but it seems like, well, the text doesn't say, did God tell Abraham to go to Egypt? The implication is he hasn't been in the promised land very long. And so, in one sense, maybe putting words in Abraham's mouth, but I wonder if there was maybe some disappointment. You get to this land, you start sojourning, and you find there's a drought going on. And so for whatever reason, what does Abraham do? Does he stay in the promised land? Does he stay? No, he leaves. He leaves. In fact, this is going to be an MO we see quite a bit, that when there's famine or a drought in the promised land, a lot of times God's people run down to Egypt. So maybe there's something there about trusting God, because, including Mary, Joseph, Jesus, correct. But specifically, though, Isaac, there's another drought that happens just a few years later from Abraham, and the Lord specifically tells Isaac, do not go down to Egypt specifically. And so maybe some of a stretch, but it does seem a little odd. Hey, you just get to the promised land theoretically, and then we don't read about any instructions from God, and Abraham goes down to Egypt. Does that make sense? It would possibly appear that way. Yes, Dan. Yep. Okay, so facing danger. So Linda, to your point, facing danger. So Abraham's now in Egypt, and he's concerned about something. And what's he concerned about? Okay. So he says, to Linda's point, hey, she's my sister. So apparently there's two things going against Abraham here. One is a realization that, because it says before he got to Egypt, a realization that once he's in Egypt, Egyptians could kill him and take something he has. That's one observation he has. Second observation he has is, hey, I've got something all the Egyptians are going to want. And that's Sarah specifically. And so as a result, Linda, to your point, he does say, she is my sister. And again, I think that's probably motivated due to fear. Specifically. Look in verse, well, it's really kind of, we won't read it. It's verses, I'm in chapter 12, verses 11 through 14. Here's a question, though. Was Sarah Abraham's sister? So, yeah. So if we want to stretch this thing, yes. We're going to read later in chapter 20, where this happens again, that step siblings, if you will, or half siblings, I should say more accurately. But again, the point is there's fear involved, and so Abraham takes upon himself that, hey, I need to protect myself, maybe take matters into my own hands. We'll see that happen again, right? In order to set this up. Does that make sense? So tell me about the facing delay, though. So the third thing I wrote down again, facing delay. So again, it appears I shouldn't say it appears, but Abraham has been in the promised land for a period of time. His family, a lot of big events happened between coming back from Egypt and then the Ishmael Hagar incident. A lot of big events happened. But again, Abraham and Sarah are now older, and so it seems maybe this promise is maybe taking too long to a certain degree. If you remember, who does Sarah blame for the infertility they had? Do you remember? So I'm in chapter 16 now. Flip over to chapter 16. To a certain degree, yes, but I would suggest you take it even a step further. Look in verse 2. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me. The Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go to my servant that I may obtain children by her." So that's an interesting kind of dilemma, or I shouldn't say dilemma, interesting observation that Sarah, it would seem, is placing some sort of responsibility on the Lord is the one that's preventing. The Lord gave his promise that we're going to have children, but for whatever reason, he is preventing me from fulfilling that promise to you. Does that make sense? Okay, Dan, so we're going to help him. Now, to us today, this whole Hagar, Abraham situation, that's a little unorthodox, right? Maybe a little outside our norm, obviously. I will say culturally for the Middle East, that was a fairly respectable and common practice. That for infertility couples, using a Hagar situation was totally respectable. It wasn't this controversy or even scandalous for that matter. Two sources that we can use to draw this from outside the biblical narrative. You may be familiar that there's called a Syrian marriage contract, and second one is the Code of Hammurabi. Those are two well-known examples. Here's a short quote from Hammurabi. It says, "If a man marries and his wife gives her servant to bear children, then this servant starts acting like she's equal to the wife. Because of this, the wife isn't allowed to sell her, but she can put a slave mark on her and treat her as a slave." So again, just make sure we all understand this was a respectable practice in this day and age and culture. But what we do know, was this God's plan? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so this plan, this plan fails, I think is the best way to say it. It did not have its intended consequence, or intended result, I should say, from Sarah and Abram's perspective. Ishmael is not the son of promise. He is not the one that these blessings are going to flow through. And we know that story very well. Last thing, facing danger again. So again, I'm now in chapter 20. We're just kind of working our way through this. And it's interesting, again, to lend to your point, Abraham has almost a second chance. He's worried again about this whole sister-wife situation. Hey, someone's going to kill me. This time it's a king named Abimelech, and he's very concerned about that. And so he does, what does he do? The exact same thing he did before. She's my sister. She goes to the king. Now, this situation, remember, God intervenes in a very, very big way to protect and rectify the situation. Look in verse. Let me ask you this. Why? Maybe you remember this, maybe you don't. Why did Abraham? What was the reason he gave for why he did this a second time? Do you remember? It's different than the first. The first, it seems, based purely out of fear. Look in verse 11 of chapter 20. Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." That's an interesting kind of nuance he threw in there, that I did this because I had to, because they don't fear God. And so because they don't fear God, I needed to do this in order to protect myself, and worried and fear and things like that. or I should say, the way it turns out again is a pagan king. Because remember, Abimelech does the upstanding, the honorable thing. Hey, you take it, you go. I wouldn't have done this if I would have known that, so on and so forth. Thankfully, he didn't touch her. But it's kind of interesting kind of dichotomy here. A pagan king turns out looking better than Abraham in this situation. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so there's Abraham. There's 4 examples of maybe some struggles, missteps, shortcomings, things like that. What about Isaac and Jacob? Did they have any issues that come about? Let's first talk about Isaac. Anybody remember something, maybe a shortcoming or a struggle Isaac did or mistake he made? I'm in chapter 26. I'll just say the whole sister situation comes up again. So guess what? Like father, like son. Isaac is concerned due to his wife. And so he's afraid. This is in chapter 26, verses really 7 through 11, if you will. Again, the Lord specifically tells him, don't go down to Egypt. So Isaac solicits some help from a king of that area. And again, he calls his wife his sister because he was here. Now, his was a little bit different. He and his wife were not, it appears, half siblings. So maybe it's taken even a step further than what Abraham did. What about Jacob? You may remember any possible opportunities about Jacob at all? Brian, what are you thinking of?
I guess the substitute basically Esau out of the blessing and the inheritance.
Totally agree. So there's 2 different, and they are separate. One is a birthright blessing, and one was a deathbed blessing. What was the birthright? You might remember just what's a birthright blessing? Okay, it's reserved for the firstborn, and it's a double share of the inheritance, to your point, Albert. So what happens is, basically, when Isaac died, Esau and Jacob, so think about it in our terms, the estate, if you will, is broken up into thirds. Esau gets, the firstborn, I should say, gets 2/3. The other, Jacob in this situation would get 1/3. So it's a double blessing. And so we know the story quite well, Brian, as you mentioned. Jacob gets the birthright blessing.
So this second time,
Yep, very good, very good. It is interesting. God later in Deuteronomy forbids the firstborn blessing to go to anyone other than the firstborn, which is interesting as well after this episode. Okay, so that's the firstborn blessing. What's the deathbed blessing that he... Okay, so the promised blessing you're referring to, Dan? Okay. What was the situation? I guess what I'm asking is, how did he steal? I think we say steal in this situation. How did he steal the blessing? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, it's good. I think modern day we would call Jacob a crook. I don't think you could say it any other way. As if this wasn't bad enough, his father, who is advanced in years, I won't say on his deathbed, but probably pretty close to his deathbed, who can't see, he deceives him to take this deathbed blessing. So deceiving is one thing. Deceiving your blind old father to get this, I mean, that, in my mind anyway, that maybe takes it up another level or two. So he had accomplished. His mother, Rebecca, helped in this deception. Brian, were you going to say something?
Just one, I suppose, mitigating point. One mitigating point, of course, is God told Rebecca that the older would serve the younger. So clearly God had already chosen, who am I thinking of Jacob, as opposed to Esau.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah, I mean, prophecies, God knows what's going to happen. The plans of God.
Obviously, again, man took it in his
Correct. To take it upon themselves to help God fix God, you know what I mean? Yeah. I think that's a great observation, worthwhile observation. Okay. So Dan, to your point, Jacob, and we know the story. Our kids' classes talk about all the time, right? So he dresses up and fakes being Esau, right? To his blind father. He does it by a couple different ways and whatnot. His mother helps him do that. Bad news, guess what? His older brother finds out after he returns. He goes to Isaac, hey, I'm ready for this blessing. Isaac says, I already gave it out, and that which I've given I can't. There's nothing left for you to a certain degree. And so what is Esau going to do? He's going to kill him. He says specifically, once the days of mourning have passed from my father's death, when that happens, I am going to kill Jacob. So then mother has something to say about that, right? So she finds out about that. She tells Isaac what's going to happen, gets really Isaac's permission, if you will, to send Jacob away. Send him away. Where did he go? Where? Okay, his uncle. His uncle specifically. Back to broader family, I should say. His uncle name was what, Terry? Do you remember? Starts with the L, anyone? Laban. Laban, very good. And as if there wasn't maybe one character more deceptive than Jacob, it's probably his uncle, quite honestly, right? So we remember that story, Leah, Rachel, and everything that pursues. Yeah, the deceiver is now the one being deceived. Yeah, good one. Okay, we know that. Let's quickly talk about maybe the sons of Jacob. Again, most airtime is given to Joseph, but let's talk about that. What kind of failures... Well, let me ask it this way. What about Joseph? Any come to mind in terms of maybe opportunity areas that he might have? So maybe a tough one. How so, Robert? Well done. I was thinking the exact same thing, actually. Correct. Yeah, so the broader family. Now, on one hand, I think it's safe to assume Joseph was probably a young man, right, when these dreams happen and whatnot. But I put down, a question here. Do we sometimes give Joseph a pass on the way he interacted with his brothers? Maybe that's a stretch, but I do think our words matter. The way we communicate to people, it does matter. And yes, God was at work by these visions, by these interpretations, and so his brothers would serve him. But the way Joseph communicated that to his brothers, there may be an opportunity there to a certain degree. I was thinking about today. That story. That kid's thing: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. Yeah, that's not true. That's not true at all. Our words do matter in the way we communicate to them. H.E.?
Also, I'd say it didn't help the way that his father treated him in front of his brothers.
Sure. That's a good observation, yeah. Good observation.
That we have an obligation to treat our kids as much as we can the same, but, to give them the same love.
Yep. That's great. What about any opportunity areas we'll say for his brothers? So maybe we'll say, for sake of time, maybe we'll say jealousy. We'll say arrogance. We'll say vengeance, maybe, or how's a better way to say that? I'll say vengeance. All these different attributes, I think, are at play, and we see that. Okay. So here's my... Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say the irony is...
Yeah. Another kind of interesting observation, yeah. How these things fit together. Okay, so go ahead.
The threads of the Genesis, how it figures into the New Covenant, but we, as the sons of God, are the sons of Abraham. Now, how did that come about? And, of course, Paul does a great dissertation through the several epistles, saying that God chooses who the sons of Abraham are. And in Genesis, we're told, or God speaking to Abraham, saying that the descendants of Abraham will be chosen through Isaac, the son of promise.
Yep.
And so you can see that now, how it comes all the way through, that when Paul is talking to the Jews saying, no, God chooses who the sons of Abraham are. Look at Genesis. They're chosen through Isaac.
That's a great point. It's a great segue too, because so here's again part one of our study tonight. The objective was to see the several mistakes, struggles these individuals faced, and I think we've done that. I think we've made an argument that hey, there was several things along the way that were just poor decisions, lack of faith, fear, worry, anxiety, taking matters into their own hands to try to help God with the promise and things like that. But part two here, and this is what I want to get into, is that God's in work, God's in play, God continues to intervene, protect, bless, redeem this family. Okay, so Brian, that's a great segue. Real quick, I kind of teased this point a little bit on when we ran out of time Sunday morning. I think this is connected back to the Tower of Babel in a very specific way. Remember, what was the objective of mankind, the people at the Tower of Babel? Why were they building a tower? You remember? Well, they wanted to reach the heavens, but that wasn't the objective of it. To make a name for themselves. Make a name for themselves. That was what they were trying to accomplish. We're going to make a name to ourselves. We're going to build a tower up into the heavens like God. I think there's some irony here, and it's very interesting how this kind of works together, is that God says no. That's not how it's going to happen, and He does some specific things to intervene and make sure that it doesn't happen. I think, Brian, you alluded to a second ago. Instead, God chooses this no-name guy, Abram at the time, and chooses to make his name great. You see that? Mankind says we will make a great name for ourselves. God says, no, I'm choosing a no-name guy, and I'm going to make his name great. So here's the question. Why? Why is God choosing to make Abram's name great? I think Brian was there, or where I was going anyway. You're probably way past where I was going, but look in chapter 12 again. I'm going back to chapter 12, and in verse 3. Again, we already read this section, but looking at verse 3, God says, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is kind of what Paul talks about in his dissertation on that. So it seems, and I'm at least making the argument, I think, that God is using Abraham, or this family, as a means or a mechanism to bless everyone, to bless all mankind. So I'm going to give Abraham a great name, and through Abraham, all my blessings will then be disposed to all mankind. Does that make sense? Kind of the connection points there? Good. Anything you want to add there, Brian? You were going to say something a second ago.
All the descendants of Abraham in the flesh. Now you got to look before Abraham and see how God handled that. But Abraham is the father of many nations. He's the father, ultimately, of Jesus through King David, of which now we have been named the descendants of Abraham. And we're also called the sons of promise, just like Isaac was.
Sure. And maybe take it a step further, too, or I should say another validation to that point. On Mount Sinai, remember, let me back up. The rest of really the biblical narrative focuses on this one family and how through this family, God's blessings are going to be bestowed upon mankind. In addition, I think it's fascinating and interesting. Later on in Mount Sinai, Israel, this family, Israel, is called a priest to all nations. So that's the verbiage that's used here. And so I think the connotation, again, Brian, just say it a different way, what you were just saying, is that God wants to use this family, Abraham, to show and to bring blessings again to other ones. So I said that wrong. He wants to show his nature, use this family of priests, to show his nature and his intentions for all mankind to save and redeem. Going back to Genesis chapter 3. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Yeah, Albert.
God did choose is so human, and the flaws that we've talked about or the mistakes they've talked about are still today challenges for me. I'm not going to speak for everybody,
Sure.
but I just it wasn't a royal family of noble that carried the name on that was chosen. It was a person like me today in 2021 that takes plans into my own hands and then realize God has a plan for me, and I try to correct, I try to adjust, and then I realize I need to turn to my faith and rely on my faith and keep hope and faith of what's going on. So just in seeing this, I can't really cast a stone at this crew
Right.
because their flaws are within me, and it hit me.
Oh, that's a good point. Good point. I do think it's interesting, too. So God formalizes, Brian, I think you alluded to a second ago, these are promises in chapter 12. But God formalizes these promises in a covenant. He does it in chapters 15 and in chapter 17. And remember the story, right? It's a fantastic, God tells Abraham to look where? Up at the stars. It says, so shall your descendants be. And having no kids, and no really, I say possibility, but no real prospects of that, if you will. Look in chapter 15. I'm looking at verse 6. Abraham believed in God. So again, shortcomings, mistakes, failures, but Abraham trusts in God to keep his promise. And again, God formalizes this this covenant, I should say, with Abraham. Verse 6 says, and he believed in the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. I might suggest that may be the first kind of definition of faith we have in Scripture. Believed in God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. Okay, so, go ahead, Brian.
I would just add one other thing here. The promised blessing, of course, was Christ, but the promise was eternal life, which God promised before the world was created and time began, Titus chapter 1, verse 2. The promise was first spoken to us through Abraham. But if you recall, in Genesis 22, God, to add to what you just said, swore an oath.
Yep.
Which in Hebrews chapter 6, which I think is Paul writing, talks about how certain our salvation is because he swore an oath. But now we have the promise, which is unilateral and unbreakable because God can't law. He gave us confirmation that he's going to keep that promise by swearing an oath. And then, as you just said, he codified it into law of his covenant. So we got three assurances of salvation through Christ: the promise, the oath, and the covenant.
Yep. Good point. Thank you. And that covenant's even reaffirmed in the giving of the law on Mount Sinai in Leviticus specifically. So it's an affirmation of that covenant, not a new covenant, to be clear. Okay, so let's fast forward. We're going to cut some stuff. Let's just fast forward here. Run out of time here. So Joseph is now, we remember the story of Joseph very well. He's in Egypt. Things have gone very well for him. His brothers come down. There's this reconciliation. Look in chapter 50. Let's move there, just read just a couple final verses and close this thing out. Genesis chapter 50. That I think, this kind of this family dynamic, if you will, the blessings through this family, kind of summarizes it here to a certain degree. Verse 19. Joseph says, but Joseph said to them, his brothers, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. No doubt Joseph is talking about the current situation that's going on with the famine in Egypt. But if we might make an analogy or extrapolate from that, that's our situation. God meant it. This whole situation was was evil intent, but God was at work, and God meant it for good, so that we might too be saved. Us, the rebellious creation that went against the Father in the beginning, that broke that fellowship, God has taken upon himself to redeem us specifically. Make sense? I think we have 4 minutes. Okay, one final thing I might mention. Here's kind of your messianic, we've talked about, I should say. There's several messianic things in the book of Genesis. Abraham sacrificing Isaac, or the about to do that specifically. I do think it's interesting that in chapter 49, Jacob is about to die. Okay, so if you recall, he's on his deathbed to a certain degree, and what he wants to do is he wants to bless each of his 12 sons. And we read about this almost in a poetic-based way, and so he maybe certainly lines them up, and whatever it is, the one comes before them, each in front of that one. Do you remember what he says about Judah, by chance? Brian remembers. Well done, well done. But better you than me. That's almost obscure to me. So let's read that just real quick. Look in chapter 8. So Judah, so this is this is Jacob talking to Judah. He says, verse 8, Judah, your brothers shall praise you, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub from the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and a lioness, who dares arouse him? Verse 10, Brian, you just mentioned it. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. Here's a key point. And to him shall the obedience of all peoples be. What's he talking about? Talking about Jesus. Talking about the future. Brian, go ahead.
Notice here that Jacob has prophesied the creation of a nation that is hundreds of years away. He's also prophesying the destruction of the nation, and he's prophesying the coming of the Messiah, who will come when the ruling authority departs.
Right.
Judah.
Right.
All of which occurred.
All of which occurred. Yep. Good observation. I don't know about you, but obviously not Brian. I forget about this being kind of buried at the end of Genesis chapter 49. This direct prophecy specifically of Jesus coming. And so, again, this future king is the one we read about really in Genesis chapter 3, that someone's coming to redeem this broken creation back to God. And so, again, not to be redundant, but God chooses this family, this no-name guy, Abraham, makes his name great so that all these nations are going to receive these blessings. And the way they're going to receive them is because there's a king that's coming, specifically that we read about, that we just did, I should say. And so really the book of Genesis concludes, it's really kind of a cliffhanger, right? Because it concludes with all these promises, these covenants, these grand things that God is going to bring about to these people and to really all mankind. How does it end? A big family sitting in Egypt. That's it. Those promises have yet to be fulfilled, or even, I shouldn't say, they've been yet to be fulfilled in any sort of big way. And so it almost forces us as the readers to keep turning pages. Okay, how's this going to work out? How is God's plan going to manifest stuff? Because the last thing we read is, hey, there's a family, pretty decent size, they're sitting in Egypt. And obviously we know kind of what's going to come as a result of that. Does that make sense? Kind of these different connection points and how these fit together, kind of the broader narrative? Again, it keeps going back to Genesis chapter 3, how God is going to choose to redeem. And specifically, he does it through this family to us. Any final thoughts, questions, comments? All right, let's call it. Thank you, guys. We're going to pick up Exodus on Sunday.